How do we convert the city? Is a question often asked by urban Christians, although too seldom answered by theologians. In his short 145-page book, Metropolitan Manifesto, Richard Bledsoe comprehensively converses with the question, utilizing his understanding of covenantal theology, the biblical theology of James Jordan, and the theology of history of Eugen Rosenstock Hussey. While this book does have entertaining personal stories of the efficacy of this model for converting the city, it would be fair to describe it as a summary of Dr. Bledsoe's own reading of Rosenstock Hussey's Outer Revolution and a roast of Dr. Jordan's insight to the first few chapters of Genesis and his work, Crisis Opportunity and the Christian Future. The following video essay is a reflection on Rich's thesis using the narrative structure of a Metropolitan Manifesto discussing the city, the prophet, and the bride. Why the emphasis on the city? Dr. Bledsoe, between chapters 3 and 4, argues from the theses of Jim Jordan's Crisis Opportunity of the Christian Future and Eugen Rosenstock Hussey's Outer Revolution that in our age, the level to focus on is the county and city. As I've described in my previous work on Jordan's essay, time goes through the cyclical ages of tribe, nation-state, and empire, or from local, national, and global scales. Jim Jordan describes that as we are coming to the end of the third age of that cycle of spirit, empire, and globalism, we are retrogressing towards a tribal model. This tribal model, for Bledsoe's purposes, is the level that is most immediate to us. Furthermore, it's difficult to work on the state or national level, but we should be working within our local cities and county boards. For example, the efficacy and veracity of this are evidently seen in the progress of the abolitionist movement on a city or county level, rather than through state or national legislation. Dr. Bledsoe utilizes the nature of a city as both global and local to vindicate the prophetic inferences Rosenstock Hussey makes in the 17th chapter of his major work, that the next move for humanity is towards the rise of a global economy and simultaneous neo-tribalism. Thus, the future, according to this 1930s German historian, would be simultaneously international and local. This is no any more truer than the city, which is the locus for the local community, and are also the members of the international economy, culture, and travel. Thus, the city is a primary battleground or area of emphasis in the church militants' efforts toward progressing salvific history. The biblical theology of the city. Before any discussion about the nature of metropolitan reform, we must begin with a broad biblical theology of the city. Loosely, the city bookends the entire Bible as many other things do. The city and its composite image of city, people's bride, mother, and temple begin the first few chapters of Genesis 2 through 11, and also is the culmination of Revelation chapters 17 to 22. Explicitly, the biblical theology of the city begins with the Enoch factor. After Cain kills Abel, we read in Genesis 4, verses 16 to 17, quote, "Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord, and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. When he built the city, he named the city after the name of his son, Enoch." End quote. Thus, we know cities are built off shed blood and are dedicated to a name. This, as we already know, begins a grotesque motif for the city. Furthermore, the next instance of the city is in chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel. Babylon is not only one people sharing the same lip and same words, but the intent of their building is to ascend to the heavens and to make a name for themselves. Verse 11. Although, by the end of the scriptural meta-narrative, we find that the city is redeemed. The city becomes the light set atop a high place. Matthew 5:14. The New Jerusalem above is the antithesis of Babylon and is our mother, Galatians 4:26. The New Jerusalem is a holy city, a temple or dwelling place for God, and his people are ultimately the groom bride that is married to the second person of the Godhead, Revelation 21. In Revelation, we see the city is truly the church, and as Dr. Bledsoe describes, the center of every city is a temple or what it worships, chapter 5. For the purposes of this video essay, this is broadly the biblical theology of the city that Dr. Bledsoe utilizes. Prophetic pastor chaplains. The city is not only a people with its religion or lip at its center, but is ruled by a head. Although the modern mayor does not exhaust the same autocratic power as the prince-governor did between the medieval period up until the post-Reformation, God made us to be a corporate people with a corporate head. The church as bride has its head, Christ. Every local congregation has its head, the pastor. So also does every city have its head, the mayor. Thus, the conversion of a people is through its covenantal head. The key to the reformation or renewal of a city is thus through the transformation and resurrection of its mayors or elected officials. Regarding the mayor and pastor, Dr. Bledsoe furthermore describes in Chapter 1 how the pastor and politician share the same duty as leader and shepherd. Although the difference between these two offices is that the pastor is aware of the death and resurrection that is fundamental to the entire world. The death and resurrection of Christ is not only the beginning of a new city, but is the element or the ta stoicheia that is the fundamental building block of the new cosmos. The death and resurrection pattern thus inhibits all of life, including that of public office. Every politician will have a crucifixion that usually leads to the end of his time in office. The pastor, however, is aware of this motif that invades all of life. Thus, as a pastor, he takes on the office of a prophet to witness about the possible resurrection that can occur. The pastor is thus a prophet if he can be in the ear of the king. One of the key things that a prophet does is make sense of the time. As Christians, we are to be men of Issachar who know the times and know what to do, 1 Chronicles 12:32, and can thus be wise to the king. Bledsoe shares from his own observations that one of the best ways to capture the conscience of a king is how he prophesies to every newly elected official he chaplains that the first year would be the honeymoon period, the second year more difficult, but by 3.5 years, all hell breaks loose and suddenly he is made to be a scapegoat by the very people that put him in office. Another example Bledsoe gives is the musical chairs that occurs amongst most university and college presidents about every 4 years. For a prophetic chaplain pastor, this may first sound unruly to describe at the beginning of the officials and chaplain's relationship, although when trials begin, usually 3.5 years into office, they often remember and put even more trust in the chaplains that prophesied this from the beginning. This pattern of 3.5 is not some supernatural number. This is something we see throughout the scriptural narrative. Consider the first instance we find the number in how Elijah cursed the land to not rain for 42 months, or 3.5 years. Our dear Lord's ministry was about 3.5 years until he was crucified. 3.5 is a half of 7, a number of fullness and completion as we see at the beginning of the creation account. 3.5 is thus a curse because it is completion, creation, or recreation, but is cut short or into. James 5:17, 1 Kings 18:1, Daniel 9:27, Revelation 11:2, Revelation 12:6, and Revelation 13:5. Just as Joseph and Daniel had some godly knowledge to make sense of the dreams of Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar, so also must a prophet make sense of the troubling realities the mayor experiences. Lastly, the work of his chaplain is one of relationships. For a prophetic chaplain to gain the privilege and ability to be heard requires not only the godly insight mentioned above, but genuine concern for the elected official as an actual person. This involves regularly pursuing how to pray for them, being someone to who they can confide in, and to some degree being under the radar and inconspicuous to the profile of the official. Furthermore to that last point, Bledsoe points out how usually it is the pastor of a church with between 100 to 200 members that is best for the job. Firstly, the work of a chaplain is relationally intensive. Secondly, large megachurches are often seen as voting blocks in the eyes of the politician. And thirdly, being publicly associated with a known pastor can cause problems through guilt by relation. Hence, it is the undistinguished pastor of a moderately sized congregation that is best suited to be a chaplain. The bride and the city. The New Jerusalem is eschatologically described through the imagery of a city and the image of Christian marriage. The final and culminating facet of a city being a bride is not only rich for contemplation, but true for any city advancing towards its heavenly archetype. In his fifth and final chapter, Bledsoe argues that the renewal of the city is through the advancement of Christian marriage. The new city is between one husband and one wife. The chaotic monisms of homosexuality, the neurotic confusion of feminism, and the sterility from cohabitation do not beget fruit for postmillennial progress. Christian marriage bears good fruit, rather than sacrificing their children for the sake of entrepreneurial advancement. Of course, cities can still exist with those unholy sacrilegious harlotries. We see it in the horror of Babylon, who drinks blood and is herself destroyed by her pimps. But these cities, because they neurotically suppress that which they cannot eliminate, are judged by the righteous and die with no expectation of resurrection. The city of Babylon is the culmination of the sui amori and the libido dominandi that Augustine describes of ancient Rome in chapters 2 and 14 in the City of God. To that point, Bledsoe describes that, quote, young professionals and graduate students have descended to the levels of Roman slaves. These Roman slaves were allowed to have sexual liaisons, but not usually permitted to marry. They couldn't marry because they would need to be sold on the market at any moment determined by their owners. Concurrently, many young professionals and graduate students do not marry after cohabitating for years for the sake of freedom to move according to the forces of a market or the opportunity towards job advancement. End quote. Hence, liaisons, not marriages, are made. Dr. Bledsoe is succinct in his last words. Quote, however, it is a marriage that will give the market its proper boundaries and structure. Apart from markets, real freedom or economic viability is conceivable, but the market cannot be sovereign over all human activity. The mark of Babylon the Great is its trade in the bodies and souls of men, Revelation 18:13. Marriage by faith will tell markets that they cannot transgress the boundaries of that relationship and what is closest to it. Every era needs an image, an idea, a pericope of scripture to live by. Historically, God has led humanity to the truth it needed most at the time, especially when the world is called into a new age. New Jerusalem, the city of a bride, is that emblem. The advisor to the king must help orient leaders to this image. Once our leaders are captured by this truth and love it, they will call those around them and under them to newness and hope in the creation of a new world. Pages 136 to 137, end quote. To conclude this video essay, the stratagem for conquering the city is through its heads. Pastor chaplains must advise the solution of Christian marriage and prophesy the pattern of ministry, crucifixion, and resurrection to the heads of every city through relationship, prayer, and counsel. The heads of every household must love their wives and build the city and its church through the proliferation of the child saints. Finally, the blessed city must continue to submit herself to Christ her head, sharing her husband's wisdom to the world, inviting stragglers into his household, and dining with her Lord and his children every Lord's Day.